In late 2009, WikiLeaks set up home in the Iceland capital of Reykjavik. It was a perfect fit. Iceland has world-class internet. Its constitution forbids censorship. Julian Assange was made welcome. It was here that Assange received the first leaked cable of the now famous Cablegate documents. It centred on the US Embassy in Reykjavik. Birgitta Jonsdottir, an Icelandic MP, was working with WikiLeaks. She received an invitation to a cocktail party at the embassy.
Cocktail parties are mind-numbingly boring, and I only go if I have a reason. So I actually decided, I thought it was sort of funny, and I'm a bit of a prankster sometimes. So I decided it would be quite funny for me to go with one of the WikiLeaks people to the embassy.
She invited Julian Assange, but on the day of the cocktail party, she couldn't find him. Birgitta Jonsdottir decided not to go, but Assange did. In a moment of monumental chutzpah, Julian Assange inveigled his way into the cocktail party here at the US Embassy. He struck up a conversation with US diplomat Sam Watson. Several weeks later, Assange published confidential cables authored by the very same diplomat. Now, Sam Watson hadn't leaked, and neither had any of the other US Embassy staff. Nonetheless, there was a massive internal investigation.
I think that many people thought that he had actually gone in and mysteriously sucked out the cables with some spy device or something.
But once the document came out, it was convenient to say it might have come from the embassy.
Of course, yeah.
Which would have driven the United States intelligence agencies crazy trying to find out where this leak came from.
Yes. Well, you know, they all need to have a reason to earn their bread.
It was the first act of humiliation by WikiLeaks of the world's greatest superpower, but it was nothing compared to what was to come.
Light them all up.
Collateral murder.
Come on, fire!
The gunning down of unarmed civilians in a Baghdad street.
Clear.
And the Afghan war logs. 8 months after his taunting of the US in Iceland, Assange landed in Sweden. He was now a cyber celebrity.
I would say it was like a pop star arriving in Sweden. He made public appearances, and many media companies wanted to talk with him about the eventual cooperation with WikiLeaks.
Assange had come to Sweden to speak at a conference, but he was also there for more intriguing reasons. To negotiate the use of a former underground nuclear fallout shelter that stores internet servers. It would provide first-class security against the prying eyes and ears of the world's intelligence agencies. The bomb shelter houses the computer hardware of Rick Falkvinge's Swedish pirate party.
We contacted them first, as in just offering service space, right?
Yep.
It might sound like a wacky organisation, but in Sweden it's taken seriously enough to have a member in the European Parliament. The party's close to WikiLeaks.
So we knew about them, they knew about us, we saw they were in trouble, and we said, hey guys, we might be able to help you out here.
Falkvinge offered WikiLeaks some space in the bunker.
It's an amazing place, to be honest. But yeah, that's where we offered them hosting space. I don't know how they're using it. I shouldn't know how they're using it. That would interfere with my interests. But I understand it got quite some attention worldwide that WikiLeaks is now hosted in a nuclear bomb-proof fallout shelter.
Assange was on a roll. Stockholm, August the 16th, 2010. Julian Assange caught a train from the central station. All the years of hard work were finally paying dividends for Julian Assange. Collateral murder had been released, so too had the Afghan war logs. But what would happen in the next few days would derail the WikiLeaks juggernaut. Assange was not travelling alone. His companion was Sophia Wilén, a 26-year-old admirer. As Assange and Wilén left the train to spend the night together, they could have no idea of the repercussions that would flow from their one-night stand. Assange's life would later descend into turmoil. 2 days earlier, the faithful and adoring had gathered at the LO building, Stockholm's trade union headquarters. In the audience were two women, Sophia Wilén in the pink cashmere sweater and Anna Arden. Assange was staying at Arden's flat. They'd slept together the previous night. Later, she would tell a friend she had a wild weekend with Assange. Sophia Wilén was enthralled by the Assange phenomena. She texted during his talk, "He looked at me."
He came to Sweden on the 11th of August 2010, and he had this apartment where one of these women lived. She was supposed to be away, so he could stay there. But she came home on the Friday night, 13th of August, and then they had consensual sex. And he continued to stay in that apartment until the 18th of August. But in the meantime, he made acquaintance with the other woman, and one night he traveled to her town in Sweden, and they had consensual sex.
The sex with Sophia Wilén in her apartment might have been consensual, but critically, there was a question over whether Assange had used a condom. The next day, Assange caught the train back to Stockholm. Wilén stayed at home, worried about the possibility of an STD infection. She later rang Anna Arden, Assange's lover of the previous week.
Somehow, the two women started to exchange text messages with each other and started to discuss what had happened, and they ended up at the police station, but they did not file any charges against Julian.
Arden and Wilén went to central Stockholm's Klara police station to see if they could compel Assange to take an STD test, should he refuse.
But the police interpreted what one of the girls said as some sort of sex crime having been committed. And that resulted in a prosecutor the same night issuing a warrant of arrest for Julian.
It would become a tabloid journalist's dream: sex, politics, and international intrigue. How big a story has the Assange case been here?
The Assange story has been huge, of course, because you have...
Thomas Mattsson is the editor of Expressen.
Its story has so many aspects. You have the political question, whether this is a case created to damage WikiLeaks.
At the time, though, Mattsson thought it was little more than a salacious scandal.
I think that many people, in the beginning, people were like shaking their heads, thinking that if you are innocent, well, in that case, cannot be a problem. Just show up, say that you're innocent, and you will most probably be cleared if that's the case.
Assange, in fact, did go to the Swedish police 10 days after the first allegations were made. He was interviewed but not charged with any offence, and he was free to leave the country while the inquiry continued.
In mid-September, he got a message from his then lawyer that the prosecutor did not want him and that he was for an interview and that he was free to leave Sweden. And under that assumption, he left Sweden in the afternoon of the 27th of September in good faith that he had sought for and got approval from the prosecutor to leave the country.
Assange made his way to London, holding up at the Frontline Club for Journalists. He had unfinished business with America.
This disclosure is about the truth.
Assange was at his peak, working with some of the most prestigious and influential media outlets in the world, including The Guardian and The New York Times. But ominously, 12 days after giving Assange clearance to leave the country, the Swedes issued a warrant for his arrest. 3 weeks later, WikiLeaks launched the third big hit against America, the Iraq war logs.
This is warlogs.wikileaks.org. It is.
Then the Swedish prosecutor upped the ante. With Assange now working on the release of the biggest and most sensitive case of US cables yet, Sweden issued an Interpol red notice for his arrest.
You only need to look at the way that red notices are used around the world. Red notices are normally the preserve of terrorists and dictators. The president of Syria does not have a red notice alert. Gaddafi in Libya, at the same time Julian's arrest warrant was issued, was not subject to a red notice, but an orange notice. It was incredibly unusual that a red notice would be sought for an allegation of this kind.
The timing of the red notice could not have been worse. US Army soldier Bradley Manning had allegedly leaked more than 250,000 classified documents, and Julian Assange was anxious to get them out. They became known as Cablegate.
There are so many thousands of stories that have come from that and have influenced elections and have been involved in the course of revolutions.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure of classified information. It puts people's lives in danger, threatens our national security, and undermines our efforts to work with other countries to solve shared problems.
An outraged Washington set up a crack team of Pentagon investigators to take on WikiLeaks. It even launched a legally questionable financial blockade to starve WikiLeaks of funds. For America, Cablegate was the final straw. Some even wanted Assange dead.
This guy's a traitor, a treasonist, and he has broken every law of the United States. The guy ought to be, and I'm not for the death penalty, so if I'm not for the death penalty, the only one to do it, illegally shoot the son of a b****.
Well, what about it? This little punk, now I stand up for Obama. Obama, if you're listening tonight, you should take this guy out, have the CIA take him out.
If Assange was looking for support from home, he didn't get it.
You know, I absolutely condemn the placement of this information on the WikiLeaks website. It's a grossly irresponsible thing to do and an illegal thing to do.
The then Attorney General threatened to revoke his Australian passport. It was only because the federal police believed that Assange's passport was the best way to track him that he kept it.
Well, the Prime Minister and the Attorney General are US lackeys. I mean, it's as simple as that. They had a whole of government task force involving every intelligence agency and the Australian Federal Police and the Department of Defence and him trying to work out how to deal with WikiLeaks and me personally.
Though the task force found that Assange had broken no law, his more immediate worry was that his extradition to Sweden would be a backdoor to onward extradition to the United States. For more than 500 days, Julian Assange and his legal team fought his extradition through the magistrates' courts to the High Court and on to the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the land. But on June the 14th, Julian Assange lost his final appeal. The Supreme Court ruled he'd have to be extradited. 5 days later, Assange fled to the Ecuadorean Embassy in London.
Hello.
Last month, we managed a brief phone call from a London hotel with Assange in the embassy.
Oh, hang on, I'm just going to put the speakerphone on. 1 second, sorry.
He revealed why he was seeking political asylum.
Yes, there were a number of dramatic events that occurred just beforehand. First of all, the Swedish government publicly announced that it would detain me without charge in prison under severe conditions. On the same evening, the UK government security contractors that maintain the electronic manacle around my leg turned up unannounced at 10:30 p.m. And insisted on fitting another manacle to my leg, saying that this was part of routine maintenance, which did not sound to be credible.
Assange sensed the net was tightening around him.
Then the next day, the Crown Prosecution Service, acting, we believe, on behalf of the Swedish government, requested that the 14 days that I had to apply to the European Court of Human Rights be reduced to 0.
Assange is safe all the time he remains inside the embassy. But once he steps out, it's almost certain he'll be arrested and extradited to Sweden.
The minute he hits Swedish soil, he will be arrested. He will be brought to a custody jail. He will be kept there in isolation for 4 days. He can only meet with me and my co-lawyer. On the 4th day, he will be brought into a courtroom in handcuffs in front of a custody judge, and they will decide whether he will be kept in custody up until the final court case is tried, or if he will be released. I will try to get him released, of course, but at least 4 days in Sweden, in Swedish prison, we can't avoid that.
At the heart of the matter is whether the Swedish judicial authorities will treat him fairly. Certainly, events so far provide a disturbing picture of Swedish justice. Using facts agreed between the defence and prosecution and other verified information, we've pieced together what happened during those crucial 3 weeks in August. On August the 11th, 2010, Assange arrived in Sweden to attend a conference organised by the Swedish Brotherhood, a branch of the Social Democratic Party. He was offered Anna Ardin's apartment while she was away, but Ardin returned home a day early on Friday the 13th. She invited Assange to stay the night, and they had sex. She would later tell police Assange had violently pinned her down and ignored her requests to use a condom. Assange denies this. The following day, Assange addressed the conference with Ardin at his side. Later that afternoon, Ardin organised the Swedish equivalent of a top-notch barbecue, a crayfish party. She posted a Twitter message. Julian wants to go to a crayfish party. Anyone have a couple of available seats tonight or tomorrow? The crayfish party was held that night in a courtyard off her apartment. It went on until the early hours of the morning. Ardin tweeted at 2 a.m. Sitting outdoors at 2 o'clock and hardly freezing with the world's coolest, smartest people. It's amazing. A guest at the party would later tell Swedish police the event was a very hearty evening. When he offered to put Assange up at his apartment, Ardin replied, "He can stay with me." In the past 24 hours, Ardin had worked closely with Assange, had sex with him, organised a crayfish party on his behalf, and, according to one witness, turned down alternative accommodation for him. It is during this same period that police will later investigate whether Assange coerced and sexually molested Anna Ardern.
Well, if you send text messages like that, I've just spent some time with the coolest people in the world. The night after, you then say you were raped. I mean, you shouldn't write such text messages if you had been raped by that person the night before.
Your client described Julian Assange as a cool man, I think one of the coolest men in the world that she'd had in her bed.
I will argue in court. I have, of course, arguments concerning exactly what you're talking about now, but I will not tell any media of how I'm going to represent the women in court. I'm sorry.
But can you see how that looks as though...
Yes, of course I can.
I can tell. It looks as though they are, in fact, setting him up for this.
I'm quite aware of that.
Sunday, August the 15th, the next day, Assange attended a dinner party at Stockholm's Glenfiddich restaurant, organised by Pirate Party founder Rick Falkvinge.
I think a lot of people at the table had meatballs. I think Julian might have been one of them. Now, Swedish meatballs, that's a little bit like mom's apple pie in Sweden. As in, you can call my wife ugly, you can kick my dog, but the instant you say something bad about my mother's meatballs, I'm going to take it personal.
Also at the dinner was Anna Ardern. So just to get this straight, Julian Assange arrived with Anna Ardern and he left with Anna Ardern.
Yep.
What was their behaviour like towards each other?
Well, I was discussing mainly with Julian, and again, I can't go into too much detail here, but it was at least a very professional dinner. It was two high-level organizations, both intent on changing the world, behaving professionally.
The fact that Anna Ardern accompanied Julian Assange to this dinner and left with him, what does that say to you?
Well, that's going into speculating on merits of extradition, and I can't really do that. I think that you're presenting an objective fact, as did I, and if people want to read something into that, that's obviously ripe for doing so, but I can't spell it out.
Four Corners has obtained a photograph lodged with police investigators from that evening. Anna Ardern is on the left. Afterwards, Assange would again spend the night at her apartment. The following day, August the 16th, Assange had sex with Sophia Wilén at her apartment. According to police records, Ardern was aware that he had slept with Sophia. A witness told police he contacted Anna Ardern looking for Assange. She texted back, "He's not here. He's planned to have sex with the Kashmir girl every evening, but not made it. Maybe he finally found time yesterday." That same day, the witness asked Ardern, "Is it cool he's living there? Do you want, for me to fix something else?" According to the witness, she replied, "He doesn't like sleep at nights, so that's a bit difficult. So he has a bit of a difficulty taking care of his hygiene, but it's okay, he lives with me. It's no problem." 3 days later, on August the 20th, Wilén, accompanied by Ardern, went to the Klara police station in central Stockholm to seek advice about whether Assange could be forced to take an STD test. Ardern had gone along primarily to support Wilén. Sometime during Wilén's questioning, the police announced to Ardern and Wilén that Assange was to be arrested and questioned about possible rape and molestation. Wilén became so distraught she refused to give any more testimony and refused to sign what had already been taken down.
The circumstances leading up to the issue of the arrest warrant gave cause for grave concern for Julian about the procedures that were adopted in the investigation. We have to remember that when the announcement was put out that he would be subject to a warrant, One of the complainants was upset by that and later said that she felt railroaded by the police.
Well, what happened was that the duty prosecutor got a phone call from the police, and the duty prosecutor decided that he should be arrested.
And what happened?
He was arrested in his absence, but they never got in contact with him. But he was arrested in his absence. That's a technical thing in Swedish law, yeah.
The prosecutor's office might not have contacted Assange, but within hours they let the whole of Sweden know what was going on, leaking to the Expressen tabloid the statements of Ardin and Wilén. The newspaper front page read, "Assange hunted for rape in Sweden."
Julian wakes up the following morning to read the newspapers to hear that he's wanted for double rape and is absolutely shocked.
Two of our reporters had information about Julian Assange, and we also had a confirmation from the prosecutor which confirmed on record that there was a police investigation against Julian Assange.
It was now the case took a strange twist. Within 24 hours, a more senior prosecutor dismissed the rape allegations, leaving only the lesser accusation of molestation. Assange willingly went to the police on August the 30th and made a statement. During the interview, he expressed his fears that anything he said would end up in the tabloid newspaper Expressen. The interviewing police officer said, "I'm not going to leak anything." The interview was leaked.
Why did you leak his name to a tabloid paper? How can you drop the case and reopen the case, and how can you not say that he waited for 5 weeks in Sweden voluntarily to participate in the investigation? Why do you have to arrest him? Why do you have to keep him in handcuffs? Why can't you conduct this in a proper manner? The rest of the world sees it, but Sweden unfortunately does not.
It's perhaps understandable that Assange had doubts he'd receive fair treatment from the Swedish authorities. On September the 15th, the prosecutor told Assange he was permitted to leave Sweden. Assange, back in England, would later offer to return within a month. The Swedish authorities said, too late. A second warrant had already been issued for his arrest.
He says that he left the country and then was prepared to come back at any time. Is that your understanding?
I don't believe that.
He says that he was prepared to come back in October, but the prosecutor wanted him back earlier.
I don't know. I don't believe he wanted to. He wanted to come freely back to Sweden. I don't think so.
Can you understand that the Australian people may not understand how somebody can be accused in their absence when they haven't even been interviewed, then have that rape case dropped, the arrest warrant removed, and then have it reinstituted all in the space of a few days?
Yeah, I can very well understand the confusion, and that is very difficult to understand, well, exactly how it works.
Well, you call it confusing. It may be slightly more than that.
Well, that's the way it works here in Sweden, so, well, but I can understand the confusion, definitely.
Assange, still hunkered down in the London Embassy, has no doubt what his fate will be if he's extradited.
If I was suddenly taken to Sweden, I would not be in a position to apply for political asylum in relation to the United States. It would be the end of the road. I would just be taken from one jail to another.
The US has said specifically, the US ambassador to London said they would wait to see what happened in Sweden. And so we are very concerned about the prospect that once matters are resolved in Sweden, there will be an extradition request from there, and he will not be able to travel home to Australia and will have to fight extradition in the Swedish courts.
The US ambassador to Australia suggests that Washington isn't interested in the Swedish extradition.
It's not something that the U.S. cares about. It's not interested in it. Hasn't been involved in it. And frankly, if he's in Sweden, there's a less robust extradition relationship than there is between the U.S. and the UK. So I think it's one of those narratives that has been made up. There's nothing to it.
That's diplomatic speak. That doesn't mean anything. Their last statement 3 days ago by their spokesperson, Boyd, says we are continuing our investigation of WikiLeaks. So you can't accept those words.
Michael Ratner, Assange's New York lawyer, believes there's an easy solution to the issue.
If they flatly said, we will not prosecute Julian Assange, that would be a very different kind of statement. My view is they should say that. I think they should say it, one, because then Julian Assange could leave the Ecuadorian Embassy, go to Sweden, deal with Sweden, and continue on with his life.
But Ratner thinks that's not what the United States wants. He's convinced a grand jury is investigating WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Four Corners has obtained a copy of a subpoena from a grand jury, which is examining evidence for possible charges relating to conspiracy to communicate or transmit national defence information and obtaining information protected from disclosure from national defence. Critically, the subpoena contains the identifying codes 10 and 3793.
There's a grand jury currently sitting in Alexandria, Virginia. And the grand jury's number, and it's interesting, the grand jury's number is 10, standing for the year it began, GJ, which is grand jury, and then 3793. 3 is the conspiracy statute in the United States. 793 is the espionage statute. So what they're investigating is 3793, conspiracy to commit espionage.
Certainly anyone associated with Assange is feeling the heat of the US authorities. Icelandic activist Smari McCarthy worked on the collateral murder video. We caught up with him at a Reykjavik hotel. So what is it about WikiLeaks that changed everything?
It industrialized the process of leaking.
McCarthy flew into Washington earlier this year to attend a conference. Security officials had him in their sights the moment he stepped off the plane.
When I get out through the doorway, there's two Border and Customs Control officers. One of them takes a look at my passport, says, yes, this is the guy, and they walk with me away.
McCarthy was questioned for several minutes about the reason for his trip before the border guards got to the point.
And then about, in the last couple of minutes, they say, well, we're actually asking you these questions because we know you're affiliated with WikiLeaks. And I say, well, I was, but I'm no longer. And they ask, so you're not in contact with Julian Assange? And I say, no, I have no contact with Julian. And they're like, oh, okay. And basically let me out. I'm on my way.
But it wasn't the last McCarthy would see of the FBI. After the conference, McCarthy had a drink with friends before heading to the Washington Metro. He missed the last train. As he walked out of the archive station, two men confronted him.
Two guys come up to me and address me by name and say they're FBI agents and would like to ask me some questions. And I say to them, well, I've had some beers and I don't have a lawyer, so no, I'm not going to answer any questions. They nevertheless give me a piece of paper with a phone number and an email address. This was not a business card, this was a piece of paper. This was just a kind of card file thing that was handwritten, and the email address was not at fbi.gov, as you would expect from FBI agents.
Just why they wouldn't give an FBI email address puzzled McCarthy.
And they say, well, they contain our full names. And I say, well, is that a problem? Well, we're afraid that if we give you our full names, then there will be retaliation against us personally from Anonymous.
The two men seemed worried he might be a member of the cyber hacker group Anonymous, which had worked with WikiLeaks.
And I say, who the hell do you think I am? I mean, I'm not like the Grand Master of Anonymous. You know, there's no. I don't even know anybody in Anonymous, right?
McCarthy's experience could be dismissed as an oddity, but in the back streets of Paris, we found someone with a very similar story. Jeremie Zimmermann heads up an internet activist group. He's a WikiLeaks supporter.
I'm a friend with Julian. I think he's a very intelligent and very witty person, and I enjoy very much the conversations we have together.
Earlier this year, as he prepared to board a plane at Washington's Dulles Airport, two men approached him about his involvement with WikiLeaks.
They didn't show any badge. So I didn't ask for one, but I saw their colleague maintaining the gate of the plane open. So I thought you don't do that with a university library card. So I thought.
So you thought they must be FBI?
I thought they must be FBI. And actually, the agent questioning me was a caricature of FBI agent, you know, with a large Joe, short hair, tight suit. And he said, well, your name was mentioned in a criminal investigation for conspiracy involving lots of people. And so which case he was referring to? It's the grand jury in Virginia. And so I asked him, thinking aloud, if I understand correctly, either I talk to you or I take full responsibility for my actions in front of a judge during a fair trial. And this is where he replied immediately, have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been to jail? In an obvious attempt to intimidate me.
What do you think they were trying to achieve?
Maybe it was to turn me into an informant, to try to send me, get information from Julian or whatever. I don't know. I will never know, probably.
Zimmermann was stopped roughly at the same time, coming back from a similar thing with McCarthy. So I don't know who would be tricking them into thinking they were FBI agents. What we've seen in a couple of these stops in the Assange WikiLeaks case is people introduce themselves as Homeland Security, at least in one instance, and not as FBI. And then when they get pushed a little, they have to admit they're FBI. Now, it's interesting when you think about it, these people have been hit by the FBI, and that's what also tells you that this is a Justice Department investigation of civilians.
Even Assange's UK legal advisor, Jennifer Robinson, appears to have been caught in the US dragnet.
I'd had an incredibly long day at work and I was late to the airport. I rushed out to Heathrow, handed over my passport, and the woman behind the desk was having a lot of difficulty. She couldn't check me in. She looked at me in a strange manner and said, well, this is odd. You're Australian. You're travelling home to Australia. You shouldn't need a visa. I said, well, no, I'm Australian. Here's my passport. I'm going home. And she said, I can't check you in.
A security officer took Robinson's passport away.
She came back about 15 minutes later, carrying a mobile phone, handed my passport to the woman behind the desk and said, she's inhibited. We can't check her in until we've got approval from Australia House.
Though Robinson was eventually allowed to catch the plane, she's still not received an explanation why she's on a so-called inhibited list. It doesn't appear to be an Australian government term, but US Homeland Security uses the phrase to identify people who need to be watched. Now back in England, she continues to be Assange's legal advisor. We caught up with her on a visit to the Ecuadorean Embassy.
Look, he is now preparing, gathering and preparing the materials for the purposes of his application to the Ecuadorian authorities, and essentially now it's a matter for the Ecuadorian government.
How is he? What's his manner like? How's his humour?
I've never known anyone to deal with the amount of stress that he's under as well as he does. He's in very good spirits and is still very committed to WikiLeaks work. He may be confined to the embassy, but as he showed during house arrest, that doesn't stop him. As we've said, the last 18 months, we've seen a television program, we've seen further WikiLeaks releases, so I don't think he'll let this stop him either.
Assange's primary concern is that the Australian government has never properly addressed the central question, the near certainty that a grand jury is investigating WikiLeaks and the possibility of him being charged.
We are very concerned about the prospect of potential extradition to the US. We need only look to the treatment of Bradley Manning. He's been held in pre-trial detention for more than 2 years now, in conditions for a large part of that detention which the UN Special Rapporteur said amount to torture. We are very concerned about the prospect of him ending up in the US, and the risk of onward extradition from Sweden was always a concern and remains a concern.
Once in Sweden, he'd be at the mercy of a system which has a record of complying with US wishes. And there's evidence that Sweden has acted illegally in past extraditions involving the US.
Sweden has frankly always been the United States lapdog, and it's not a matter we are particularly proud of. The Swedish government has essentially, whenever US official says jump, the Sweden government asks how high.
If that seems like a heavy-handed comment, there's evidence to back it up.
There was a famous case last decade where a couple of Swedish citizens were even renditioned by the CIA in a quite torturous manner to Egypt, where they were tortured further, which goes against every part of Swedish legislation, every international agreement on human rights, and not to say human dignity.
A United Nations investigation later found against Sweden. The country was forced to pay compensation. For Assange, coupled with his other experiences of the Swedish judicial system, it is perhaps understandable that he fears ending up in Sweden.
For me, the question really is, if I'm sitting in Julian Assange's position, I'd be very, very nervous, because the United States gets their hands on you in this case, and you're a goner. So, you know, what I get asked all the time is, well, how do you know? To me, the question isn't how I know. I know there's a lot of evidence out there that it looks like that. To me, the burden should be on the United States government to say, we are not planning to prosecute Julian Assange. If they just gave that assurance, I can guarantee you that Julian Assange would go to Sweden tomorrow.